Case 1. Hakeem Abdul Rashid. Pastor Hakeem Abdul Rashid stood behind his Georgia pulpit every Sunday morning, his voice booming with divine authority as he preached about trust, faith, and the sacred bond between shepherd and flock. His congregation hung on every word, believing they were hearing God's truth from a man called to serve their spiritual needs. But Rashid wasn't just collecting tithes and offerings. He was orchestrating one of the most brazen religious financial frauds in American history. Behind his ministerial collar and biblical rhetoric, Rashid was running a sophisticated $7 million Ponzi scheme that would destroy the lives of everyone who trusted him. His weapon of choice? A completely fabricated used car business that existed only in his imagination, and the fraudulent documents he used to steal millions from investors. The man who promised his congregation eternal salvation became their financial executioner, using his position as their spiritual leader to gain access to their life savings, retirement funds, and children's college money. He convinced church members that investing in his fake automotive empire was not just a smart business decision, it was an act of faith that God would bless. When federal investigators finally exposed his elaborate deception, Rashid received a 30-year prison sentence that ended his reign of religious terror. But his story is just the beginning of a shocking pattern that reaches the highest levels of American Christianity. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we expose the darkest secrets hidden behind positions of trust and authority. If you're passionate about true crime documentaries that reveal shocking betrayals by those who were supposed to protect us, you've found your new obsession. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're bringing you the most jaw-dropping cases of corruption, fraud, and exploitation that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about people in power. Case 2. J. Charles Jessup. In the heart of Philadelphia, Pastor J. Charles Jessup commanded attention from his pulpit with his signature Get Your Stuff sermons that promised divine prosperity to faithful believers. His charismatic delivery and confident declarations about God's desire to bless his people financially made him a beloved figure in his community, where struggling families desperately needed hope for economic breakthrough. Jessup's ministry attracted devoted followers who viewed his financial success as proof that his spiritual insights were genuine. His polished appearance and articulate preaching style convinced congregants that he possessed special understanding of biblical principles for achieving material prosperity through faithful giving and divine favor. But behind his ministerial credentials and prosperity gospel rhetoric, Jessup was orchestrating a multi-million-dollar mortgage fraud scheme that exploited the trust his religious position afforded him. His status as a respected minister opened doors with potential victims who never suspected that their spiritual leader was systematically stealing their financial futures. Federal investigators discovered that Jessup had used his ministerial authority to gain credibility with investors and lenders, convincing them to participate in fraudulent real estate transactions that lined his pockets while devastating their financial security. His religious title served as the perfect cover for sophisticated criminal activity that might have been immediately suspicious from a secular businessman. When justice finally caught up with the fraudulent pastor, Jessup received an 18-month federal prison sentence that ended his ministry and exposed the criminal enterprise he had built using his congregation's trust as collateral for his elaborate deception. Case 3. Lamore Miller Whitehead. Bishop Lamore Miller Whitehead strutted through Brooklyn's streets like religious royalty, his designer suits, luxury watches, and flashy jewelry broadcasting a message of divine prosperity that attracted followers seeking their own piece of God's supposed financial blessings. His flamboyant lifestyle and confident demeanor convinced admirers that his wealth proved his spiritual authenticity and divine favor. Miller Whitehead's church became a showcase for prosperity gospel excess, where his ostentatious displays of material success served as living advertisements for his teachings about God's desire to bless faithful believers with abundant riches. His charismatic preaching and apparent financial success made him a magnetic figure in Brooklyn's religious community. But the bishop's golden lifestyle was built on a foundation of criminal deception that targeted the most vulnerable members of his own congregation. Federal investigators uncovered evidence that Miller Whitehead had systematically exploited his spiritual authority to steal from people who trusted him with their deepest spiritual and financial concerns. The shocking truth emerged when prosecutors revealed that Miller Whitehead had stolen an elderly parishioner's entire life savings, convincing the victim that their money would be invested safely while actually funding his extravagant personal lifestyle. His crimes extended beyond simple theft to include attempted extortion of a businessman who refused to be intimidated by his religious threats. In 2023, federal prosecutors secured Miller Whitehead's conviction on multiple charges including wire fraud, extortion, and making false statements to federal investigators. The flashy bishop's reign of financial exploitation finally ended, with handcuffs instead of designer accessories, proving that even religious authority cannot protect criminals from justice. Case 4. Kant Kuntz. Traveling evangelist Todd Kuntz rolled into cities across America with a revolutionary message that turned traditional Christianity on its head. Jesus Christ himself was a wealthy man, and every true believer was destined to become a millionaire through divine blessing. His passionate sermons painted poverty as a spiritual curse that faithful Christians could break through sacrificial giving and unwavering faith in God's prosperity promises. Kuntz's revival meetings attracted desperate audiences who found hope in his bold declarations that financial struggle was never God's will for his children. His confident preaching style and apparent personal prosperity convinced struggling families that they were just one faithful donation away from unlocking the millionaire destiny that God had planned for their lives. The charismatic evangelist's ministry operated on a simple but devastating premise: convince financially desperate people to give money they couldn't afford in exchange for promises of supernatural financial breakthroughs that would transform their economic circumstances. His teachings explicitly urged followers to stretch beyond their financial limits as demonstrations of faith that would trigger divine multiplication. Kuntz's sophisticated fundraising operation specifically targeted vulnerable believers who were already struggling with debt, unemployment, and financial hardship. His ministry literature and sermons created psychological pressure that convinced victims their continued poverty resulted from insufficient faith rather than economic exploitation by a traveling predator. Critics and former followers eventually exposed Kuntz's ministry as a predatory operation that systematically extracted money from financially vulnerable people while providing nothing but false hope and deeper debt. His millionaire prophet message proved to be nothing more than a sophisticated wealth transfer scheme that made only one person rich: Todd Kuntz himself. Case 5. R.W. Schambach. R.W. Schambach commanded revival stages across America with the explosive energy of an old-school Pentecostal preacher, his fiery sermons building to crescendos that left audiences breathless and desperate for the miraculous financial breakthroughs he promised. His theatrical preaching style and passionate declarations about God's desire to bless faithful givers created an electric atmosphere where logical thinking dissolved into emotional fervor. Schambach's revival meetings became legendary for their intense focus on financial giving, with the evangelist weaving elaborate narratives about supernatural returns that would reward sacrificial donations. His booming voice and dramatic gestures convinced audiences that they were witnessing genuine spiritual authority, capable of triggering divine financial intervention in their desperate circumstances. The traveling preacher's ministry specifically targeted America's poorest communities, where his promises of miraculous financial returns attracted people who had exhausted every conventional avenue for economic improvement. His revival campaigns descended on struggling neighborhoods like financial vultures, exploiting desperation with false promises wrapped in biblical language. Shambach's fundraising techniques employed sophisticated psychological manipulation that convinced impoverished audiences to donate money they desperately needed for basic survival. His sermons created artificial urgency around giving decisions, claiming that hesitation or financial prudence demonstrated lack of faith that would prevent divine blessing. Critics documented how Shambach's ministry systematically extracted wealth from communities that could least afford such exploitation, leaving trails of financial devastation disguised as spiritual blessing. His legacy became a cautionary tale about how religious authority could be weaponized to prey upon society's most vulnerable populations through false promises of supernatural economic transformation. Case 6. George White. George White inherited more than just family connections when he married into the Copeland dynasty. He gained access to one of America's most powerful prosperity gospel networks and the credibility that came with the Kenneth Copeland name. His ministry operated under the protective umbrella of his father-in-law's empire, lending instant legitimacy to his own financial teachings and fundraising operations. White's sermons carried the same inflammatory rhetoric that made the Copeland family fortune, preaching that poverty was not just unfortunate circumstances, but actual sin that demonstrated spiritual failure. His passionate declarations convinced struggling believers that their financial difficulties represented divine judgment rather than economic exploitation by prosperity preachers like himself. The younger White expanded on Copeland family theology by teaching that divine wealth was every believer's birthright, creating an expectation that faithful Christians should live in material abundance. His ministry positioned financial struggle as evidence of spiritual rebellion against God's prosperity plan, shifting blame from economic predators to their victims. White's operation became part of a sophisticated family dynasty that normalized prosperity gospel extremism within mainstream evangelicalism. His teachings complemented and reinforced the Copeland Empire's message that questioning prosperity theology represented dangerous spiritual rebellion against God's revealed will for financial blessing. The White-Copeland connection demonstrated how prosperity gospel deception could be passed down through generations, creating family businesses built on systematic exploitation of religious faith. His ministry proved that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree when it comes to weaponizing Christianity for personal financial gain, extending the Copeland legacy of prosperity gospel predation into the next generation. Case 7. Eli Soriano and Daniel Razon. Eli Soriano and Daniel Razon built their Members Church of God International into one of the Philippines' most influential religious organizations, attracting millions of followers across the archipelago who believed their leaders possessed divine authority to guide both spiritual and financial decisions. Their sophisticated media empire and charismatic presentations convinced devoted members that absolute obedience to church leadership represented the pathway to eternal salvation. The MCGI leadership operated through a complex hierarchical structure that positioned Soriano and Razon as infallible spiritual authorities whose financial demands carried the weight of divine commandments. Their teachings created an environment where questioning leadership decisions was viewed as spiritual rebellion that could jeopardize members' eternal destiny. But former members began revealing a darker reality behind the organization's spiritual facade, describing systematic financial exploitation that drained families of their life savings while enriching the leadership. These courageous whistleblowers detailed how church doctrine was weaponized to justify increasingly demanding financial obligations that left members impoverished while funding lavish lifestyles for Soriano and Razon. Former MCGI members testified about sophisticated manipulation techniques that convinced faithful followers to surrender their financial resources as demonstrations of spiritual commitment. The allegations painted a picture of calculated exploitation, where religious authority was systematically used to extract wealth from vulnerable believers who trusted their leaders completely. The Soriano-Razon operation demonstrated how religious exploitation could operate on an international scale, with their Philippine-based organization extending its financial predation across multiple countries. Their case revealed the global nature of religious fraud and the devastating impact that corrupt spiritual leaders could have on entire communities of sincere believers seeking authentic spiritual guidance. Case 8. Barry Minkow. Barry Minkow's story reads like a twisted redemption narrative gone horribly wrong. After serving time for orchestrating one of the largest Ponzi schemes in American history during the 1980s, Minkow emerged from prison claiming to have found Jesus Christ and dedicated his life to fighting the very financial crimes he once committed. His transformation from Wall Street criminal to born-again Christian pastor seemed like the ultimate testimony of divine grace and personal transformation. Minkow's newfound religious identity opened doors that his criminal past had permanently closed, as churches and Christian organizations embraced him as a powerful example of redemption. His personal testimony about transformation from greed-driven criminal to spirit-filled minister resonated with evangelical audiences who celebrated his apparent spiritual rebirth. The reformed criminal even launched a ministry focused on exposing financial fraud, positioning himself as a crusader for justice who used his criminal expertise to protect innocent investors from predatory schemes. His unique background as both perpetrator and investigator gave him credibility with law enforcement agencies who welcomed his assistance in complex financial crime cases. But federal investigators discovered that Minkow's religious conversion was nothing more than an elaborate cover for new criminal enterprises. His pulpit had become a platform for securities fraud, where he manipulated stock prices through false reports while using his ministerial credentials to gain victims' trust. In a stunning betrayal of his redemption narrative, Minkow received his second federal conviction for using his position as a pastor and fraud investigator to commit the very crimes he claimed to oppose. His case proved that some criminals view religious conversion not as genuine transformation, but as sophisticated camouflage for continued predatory behavior. Case 9. Tony Alamo. Tony Alamo transformed his religious organization into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used spiritual authority to justify systematic financial exploitation of his devoted followers. His charismatic leadership and apocalyptic teachings convinced hundreds of believers to surrender their entire lives to his control, including their labor, assets, and financial resources that funded his increasingly lavish lifestyle. Alamo's cult operated legitimate businesses, staffed entirely by unpaid followers who worked grueling hours under the belief that their labor was sacred service to God's chosen prophet. His followers manufactured clothing, operated restaurants, and ran various enterprises that generated millions of dollars in revenue, while the workers received nothing but spiritual promises and basic survival necessities. Federal investigators discovered that Alamo had systematically evaded taxes on his multi-million-dollar business empire while forcing his followers to live in poverty. His organization claimed religious exemptions while operating purely commercial enterprises that enriched only Alamo himself, creating a sophisticated tax fraud scheme disguised as religious ministry. The cult's financial structure depended entirely on unpaid labor from followers who believed their work was divinely mandated service that would secure their eternal salvation. Alamo convinced his victims that questioning his business practices or demanding compensation demonstrated lack of faith that could result in spiritual damnation. Alamo's criminal empire eventually collapsed under federal investigation that resulted in convictions for tax evasion, child abuse, and numerous other charges. His case demonstrated how religious authority could be weaponized to create modern slavery, where victims willingly participated in their own exploitation through sophisticated spiritual manipulation that convinced them their suffering served divine purposes. Case 10. Randy and Paula White. Randy and Paula White commanded Tampa's Without Walls International Church like spiritual royalty. Their combined charisma and prosperity gospel teachings creating a megachurch empire that attracted thousands of followers seeking divine breakthrough in their financial circumstances. The power couple's apparent marital bliss and shared ministry vision made them poster children for successful Christian leadership in the prosperity movement. Their lavish lifestyle became a living advertisement for prosperity theology, with luxury cars, designer clothing, and expensive jewelry serving as supposed evidence that God rewarded faithful servants with material abundance. The Whites' ostentatious displays of wealth convinced followers that their own financial struggles could be overcome through increased giving and spiritual commitment. But public scrutiny began revealing uncomfortable questions about how the pastoral couple had accumulated their extraordinary wealth, while their congregation included many struggling families who sacrificed financially to support the ministry. Investigators and journalists documented the vast gulf between the Whites' luxury lifestyle and the financial circumstances of their devoted followers. The power couple's carefully constructed image shattered when their marriage collapsed in a bitter, public divorce that exposed the financial empire they had built together. Court proceedings revealed intimate details about ministry assets, personal expenditures, and the business arrangements that had funded their extravagant lifestyle. The divorce proceedings became a public spectacle, as Randy and Paula White fought over the division of their ministry empire, revealing the purely commercial nature of their religious enterprise. Their messy separation demonstrated how prosperity gospel marriages could become business partnerships more concerned with wealth accumulation than spiritual authenticity, leaving their congregation to witness the ugly reality behind their former pastor's supposed divine blessing. Case 11. Jesse Duplantis. Jesse Duplantis stunned the Christian world when he boldly asked his followers to donate $54 million for his fourth private jet, claiming that God had specifically instructed him to acquire the Falcon 7X aircraft for more efficient soul winning across the globe. His charismatic Louisiana charm and confident theological justifications convinced devoted supporters that funding his aviation fleet represented an investment in eternal souls rather than ministerial luxury. Duplantis defended his jet collection with elaborate spiritual reasoning, arguing that commercial airlines were filled with demons and that private aviation allowed him to travel in a prayer bubble free from worldly contamination. His teachings convinced followers that questioning his aircraft needs demonstrated lack of understanding about the spiritual warfare surrounding international ministry. The evangelist's fundraising appeals created sophisticated pressure campaigns that positioned donations to his jet fund as acts of faith that would unlock divine blessing for contributors. His television broadcasts and direct mail campaigns convinced financially struggling viewers that sacrificing for his aviation ministry would trigger supernatural financial breakthroughs in their own circumstances. Duplantis's jet fundraising campaign sparked international outrage as critics documented the stark contrast between his luxury aviation demands and the financial struggles of his supporters. Media investigations revealed how his ministry extracted millions from working-class believers to fund a lifestyle that included multiple jets, luxury homes, and extravagant personal expenses. Despite widespread criticism, Duplantis remained defiant in defending his aviation empire, claiming that his critics were spiritually blind to God's prosperity plan for his ministry. His unwavering commitment to luxury aviation, while requesting donations from struggling followers, epitomized the shameless exploitation that characterized prosperity gospel extremism. Case 12. Mike Murdoch. Mike Murdoch transformed prosperity gospel fundraising into a precise science through his infamous $1,000 special miracle offerings that promised supernatural financial breakthroughs for contributors willing to demonstrate extreme faith through sacrificial giving. His eccentric presentation style and confident biblical interpretations convinced desperate viewers that his specific donation amounts represented divine formulas for unlocking God's prosperity promises. Murdoch's television ministry operated like a spiritual marketplace, where specific dollar amounts carried supernatural power to trigger miraculous financial returns. His teachings positioned the $1,000 donation as a scriptural key that would unlock divine vaults of blessing for contributors who trusted his unique understanding of biblical prosperity principles. The flamboyant preacher employed sophisticated psychological manipulation that created artificial urgency around giving decisions, claiming that hesitation or delay would cause contributors to miss their divine breakthrough moment. His high-pressure sales tactics, disguised as spiritual teaching, convinced vulnerable viewers that questioning his methods demonstrated dangerous lack of faith. Former supporters revealed how Murdoch's seed faith teachings had devastated their family finances while providing no evidence of the promised supernatural returns. These courageous testimonies exposed how his ministry systematically extracted money from financially desperate people who trusted his claims about divine multiplication of sacrificial donations. Murdoch's operation represented prosperity gospel teaching taken to its most predatory extreme, where specific donation amounts were marketed as guaranteed pathways to divine financial intervention. His ministry demonstrated how biblical language could be weaponized to create sophisticated fraud schemes that exploited sincere religious faith for personal enrichment, while leaving victims deeper in financial desperation than before. Case 13. Robert Tilton. Robert Tilton's Success and Life television empire reached millions of desperate viewers who trusted that their heartfelt prayer requests and sacrificial donations would receive personal attention from the charismatic preacher who promised to intercede directly with God on their behalf. His passionate television presentations and confident declarations about divine intervention convinced struggling families that Tilton possessed special spiritual authority to facilitate miraculous breakthroughs. Tilton's sophisticated ministry operation processed thousands of prayer requests daily, with viewers sending deeply personal letters describing terminal illnesses, financial crises, and family disasters alongside their donations. His television program featured dramatic testimonials from supposed followers who claimed to have received miraculous answers after sending money to support his ministry. But ABC's primetime live investigation shattered Tilton's carefully constructed spiritual image when reporters discovered thousands of prayer requests dumped in trash bins behind his ministry headquarters. The shocking footage revealed that Tilton's organization was systematically depositing donation checks while discarding the heartfelt pleas for prayer that accompanied them. The explosive investigation exposed Tilton's operation as a cynical fraud designed purely to extract money from vulnerable people while providing absolutely nothing in return. His ministry had no intention of actually praying for donors or delivering the spiritual services that supporters believed they were funding through their sacrificial gifts. The 1991 exposé completely destroyed Tilton's television empire as viewers finally understood that their most intimate spiritual concerns had been treated as garbage while their donations funded his luxury lifestyle. His case became the defining example of televangelism fraud that permanently damaged public trust in religious television programming and demonstrated how easily sacred spiritual practices could be commercialized for predatory exploitation. Case 14. Creflo Dollar. Creflo Dollar launched one of the most audacious fundraising campaigns in televangelism history when he asked his global following to donate $65 million for a Gulfstream G650 private jet, claiming that his current aircraft was too old and unsafe for international ministry travel. His World Changers Church International provided the platform for this unprecedented appeal that shocked even seasoned prosperity gospel observers. Dollar's jet campaign employed sophisticated theological justifications that positioned the luxury aircraft as essential equipment for spreading the gospel worldwide. His teaching materials and video presentations convinced devoted followers that funding his aviation upgrade represented an investment in global evangelism, rather than ministerial excess that would benefit only his personal comfort and convenience. The prosperity preacher's fundraising strategy created intense psychological pressure on his congregation and television audience, suggesting that their spiritual commitment could be measured by their willingness to sacrifice for his aviation ministry. His appeals specifically targeted financially struggling supporters who were encouraged to give sacrificially despite their own economic hardships. When public outrage erupted over his $65 million jet campaign, Dollar remained defiant in defending his aviation needs while dismissing critics as spiritually ignorant about the requirements of international ministry. His unwavering commitment to luxury air travel while requesting donations from working-class believers epitomized the shameless exploitation that characterized prosperity gospel leadership. Dollar's jet campaign demonstrated how prosperity gospel teachers had become completely disconnected from the financial reality of their supporters, viewing their followers primarily as funding sources for increasingly extravagant lifestyle demands. His case revealed the ultimate evolution of prosperity theology, where ministerial luxury had become the primary goal rather than genuine spiritual service to struggling communities. Case 15. Paula White. Paula White achieved unprecedented political influence when she became Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, giving her prosperity gospel teachings a direct pipeline to the highest levels of American government. Her role as presidential confidant elevated her ministry profile, while lending governmental credibility to her controversial seed faith doctrines that promised supernatural financial returns for sacrificial donations. White's political connections transformed her from regional prosperity preacher into a national religious celebrity whose theological interpretations suddenly carried weight in policy discussions. Her White House access created powerful marketing opportunities for her ministry empire, while positioning her prosperity teachings as mainstream Christian doctrine endorsed by presidential authority. The presidential advisor's ministry operated through sophisticated seed faith campaigns that convinced financially desperate supporters to send large donations with promises of multiplied returns. Her teaching materials and television broadcasts created elaborate theological justifications for why struggling families should sacrifice money they couldn't afford to trigger divine financial breakthroughs. White's dual role as presidential advisor and prosperity preacher created unprecedented opportunities to normalize wealth extraction theology within mainstream evangelical politics. Her influence demonstrated how prosperity gospel teachers could leverage political connections to expand their financial exploitation networks while gaining protection from criticism through governmental association. White's ministry literature promised specific mathematical returns on spiritual investments, claiming that donations would be supernaturally multiplied, according to biblical principles of sowing and reaping. Her sophisticated fundraising campaigns targeted vulnerable believers with false promises that transformed sincere religious faith into profitable business opportunities for her expanding ministry empire. The combination of political authority and prosperity gospel theology made White one of America's most dangerous religious financial predators, whose governmental connections provided credibility for systematic exploitation of sincere believers. Case 16. Benny Hinn. Benny Hinn commanded global attention through his massive healing crusades that attracted hundreds of thousands of desperate people seeking miraculous cures for terminal illnesses and chronic conditions. His dramatic stage presence and claims of supernatural healing power made him one of the world's most recognizable televangelists, with his distinctive white suits and theatrical healing demonstrations becoming iconic symbols of faith-healing ministry. Hinn's international ministry empire generated enormous revenue through his television broadcasts, crusade offerings, and merchandise sales that funded an extraordinarily lavish lifestyle. His luxury hotels, private jets, and expensive clothing became subjects of intense scrutiny as critics questioned how a minister's personal wealth could be justified while his supporters often struggled financially. The U.S. Senate Finance Committee launched a formal investigation into Hinn's ministry finances, seeking transparency about how his organization collected and spent the millions of dollars donated by faithful supporters. The congressional inquiry revealed concerning patterns of financial secrecy and resistance to accountability that raised serious questions about his ministry's fiscal integrity. Investigative journalists documented Hinn's extensive history of failed prophecies and false healing claims that had devastated families who trusted his supernatural promises. His predictions about miraculous events that never materialized and healing claims that couldn't be verified exposed the fraudulent foundation of his ministry empire. Media investigations revealed the stark contrast between Hinn's luxury lifestyle and the financial circumstances of his devoted supporters who sacrificed to fund his international ministry. His expensive homes, designer clothing, and first-class travel arrangements demonstrated how prosperity gospel teaching had become a sophisticated wealth transfer system that enriched televangelists while impoverishing their followers. Case 17. Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker. Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker became the undisputed first couple of 1980s televangelism through their PTL Club television empire that reached millions of viewers who saw them as the perfect Christian family representing prosperity gospel success. Their Heritage USA theme park in South Carolina attracted 6 million annual visitors, making it America's third most popular destination behind Disney World and Disneyland. The Bakkers' emotional television presentations and lavish lifestyle convinced followers that God rewarded faithful Christians with material abundance and spiritual joy. Tammy Faye's tearful makeup and Jim's confident promises created a compelling narrative where prosperity and righteousness went hand in hand for truly committed believers who supported their expanding ministry empire. But their empire collapsed when investigators discovered that Jim Bakker had systematically defrauded supporters through his lifetime partnership program that promised services and accommodations that never existed. His ministry had oversold partnerships while using donor funds to support the couple's extravagant personal lifestyle rather than building the promised facilities. Federal prosecutors revealed that Bakker had defrauded followers of $158 million through fraudulent fundraising schemes that exploited sincere religious devotion for personal enrichment. His operation had become an elaborate Ponzi scheme where new donations funded previous promises while generating enormous personal wealth for the Bakker family. Jim Bakker's 1989 conviction on 24 federal fraud and conspiracy charges resulted in a 45-year prison sentence that destroyed the PTL empire and ended an era of televangelism excess. His fall became the defining symbol of religious greed and corruption that permanently damaged public trust in prosperity gospel ministries, proving that even the most beloved religious celebrities could be sophisticated financial predators. Case 18. Jimmy Swaggart. Jimmy Swaggart built the largest Pentecostal television ministry in the world during the 1980s, reaching over 500 million viewers globally through his passionate preaching and powerful musical performances that convinced millions they were witnessing authentic spiritual anointing. His fiery sermons against moral compromise and his apparent sincere devotion made him the undisputed leader of America's televangelism movement. Swaggart's ministry generated over $150 million annually through television broadcasts, crusades, and his Bible college that trained thousands of ministers worldwide. His emotional preaching style and righteous indignation against corruption positioned him as Christianity's moral watchdog, publicly condemning fellow televangelists for scandals while presenting his own ministry as a model of spiritual integrity. But Swaggart's carefully constructed moral image shattered when rival minister Marvin Gorman exposed his secret relationship with prostitute Deborah Murphy, providing photographic evidence that destroyed his credibility as a moral authority. The revelation came after Swaggart had orchestrated Gorman's downfall for moral failures, making his own exposure an act of calculated revenge. Swaggart's tearful "I have sinned" confession before his congregation became an iconic moment of televangelism hypocrisy, broadcast worldwide as millions watched their moral hero admit to the very behaviors he had condemned in others. His emotional breakdown appeared genuine, but his refusal to submit to denominational discipline revealed his prioritization of personal empire over authentic repentance. The scandal deepened when Swaggart was caught with another prostitute in 1991, proving that his public confession had been meaningless theater rather than genuine transformation. His second fall finally destroyed his credibility as a moral authority and demonstrated how prosperity gospel empires could survive even the most devastating personal scandals. Case 19. Pat Robertson. Pat Robertson achieved unprecedented mainstream influence through his 700 Club television program and Christian broadcasting network empire that made prosperity gospel teaching seem respectable to millions of conservative Americans who trusted his political commentary and religious authority. His sophisticated presentation style and apparent theological scholarship gave credibility to financial exploitation techniques that might have seemed obviously fraudulent from less polished televangelists. Robertson's political connections and media savvy allowed him to normalize prosperity gospel concepts within mainstream evangelical culture, making his financial appeals seem like legitimate spiritual teaching rather than sophisticated fundraising manipulation. His dual role as news commentator and religious teacher created powerful opportunities to influence public opinion while extracting donations from trusting viewers. The influential broadcaster promoted controversial prosperity theology through teachings about demons of debt that could supposedly be cast out through faithful financial donations to his ministry. His sophisticated theological language disguised wealth extraction schemes as biblical truth, convincing viewers that their financial struggles resulted from spiritual warfare rather than economic exploitation. Robertson's fundraising appeals promised supernatural financial breakthroughs for supporters who demonstrated faith through sacrificial giving to his media empire. His television programs featured testimonials from supposed viewers who claimed to have received miraculous financial blessings after donating to CBN, creating powerful psychological pressure on financially struggling audiences. Robertson's mainstream credibility helped transform prosperity gospel from fringe televangelism into acceptable evangelical doctrine that influenced countless pastors and religious leaders. His case demonstrated how sophisticated presentation and political connections could provide cover for systematic financial exploitation that might otherwise be recognized as obvious fraud, making him one of America's most dangerous religious financial predators through his ability to normalize wealth extraction theology. Case 20. Kenneth Copeland. Kenneth Copeland stands as the undisputed king of prosperity gospel exploitation, having built a televangelism empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars while maintaining absolute secrecy about his ministry's finances and aggressively defending his extraordinary personal wealth. His Kenneth Copeland Ministries operates from a sprawling Texas compound that includes private airstrips, luxury facilities, and security systems that rival corporate headquarters. Copeland's ministry has generated enormous controversy through his refusal to provide financial transparency despite receiving tax-exempt status as a religious organization. His organization's secrecy about income sources, expenditure patterns, and personal compensation has made him the subject of congressional investigations and journalistic scrutiny that revealed shocking levels of ministerial excess funded by faithful supporters. The prosperity patriarch owns multiple private jets, including a $36 million Gulfstream V that he defends with elaborate theological justifications about avoiding demons in commercial aviation. His aggressive defense of luxury air travel while requesting donations from struggling supporters epitomizes the shameless exploitation that defines modern prosperity gospel leadership. Copeland's most notorious moment came during a heated confrontation with investigative journalist Lisa Guerrero, where his aggressive demeanor and refusal to answer basic financial questions revealed the hostile attitude that prosperity preachers display when their wealth extraction schemes face scrutiny. His threatening behavior demonstrated how religious authority could become a shield for criminal-level financial exploitation. Copeland's operation represents the ultimate evolution of prosperity gospel, from spiritual teaching into sophisticated wealth transfer system that enriches televangelists while impoverishing their followers. His case demonstrates how religious tax exemptions and spiritual authority can be weaponized to create personal empires that would be obviously fraudulent in any secular context, making him America's most dangerous religious financial predator. 20 religious leaders who weaponized sacred trust to commit financial crimes that devastated countless innocent lives while building personal empires worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Each story follows the same devastating trajectory. Charismatic leaders who claimed divine authority, accumulated devoted followers who surrendered their critical thinking, built powerful organizations that extracted enormous wealth, then systematically exploited their spiritual positions to commit increasingly brazen financial crimes against the very people who trusted them most. The pattern raises uncomfortable questions about how easily religious tax exemptions and spiritual authority can be exploited to create criminal enterprises that would be immediately recognized as fraud in secular contexts, and whether society provides adequate protection for vulnerable believers seeking authentic spiritual guidance. Have you witnessed similar patterns of spiritual manipulation in your community? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And please don't forget to subscribe to Savage Case Files. Your encourages us to bring more cases like this to you.